Hello, Third World Airport listeners. It is I, David Solmore, and Adam Ginsberg here with you on a Thursday night. Um, Last episode got pretty heated. We talked about Russia, but then we talked about the new refugee ban, and it almost led to a conversation about ISIS and how to deal with the whole issue,
Not just ISIS, the whole issue in
the
Syria.
whole issue in Syria. And Adam and I thought, well, why not continue this conversation? Um, and give our views on the whole situation and what we think is a good and viable solution for the problem.
So
Um,
we've dedicated this episode here to that issue and that issue solely,
yes.
and we're excited to give this take to you. This is the first time we've ever intentionally dedicated an episode to one issue, and so we're hoping you like it.
Yeah, we're excited for this, and hopefully we'll do more of these in the future. Of course, we're still going to do current events and talk about things that are happening in politics today. But today we felt like this is a huge issue, and
It's ongoing.
you need time. You need a full episode probably to talk about an issue like this.
We need
So
days, but we don't have that. So let's get started.
yeah, let's get started. Um, So I think where we left off last time was
Let's not worry about where we left off. Let's
just to say where it leads to where it leads to now in the conversation. We said there's a humanitarian crisis, and my view was I think that these safe havens for the refugees is a good temporary solution, but I believe the permanent solution should be focusing in on Syria and trying to stabilize it so these people can come back to their homes.
just to
And that
clarify. You mean safe havens in the U.S. and in Western
safe
countries? You don't.
havens in Western Europe and Turkey or
Okay.
even in Jordan, wherever they are, I think that the focus should be to stabilize this area so that people can go back to the home where they used to live in. And our versions of how to do that, I think, is where we differentiate. But if you want to give us a background on on how this was handled under the Obama administration or your view on it and your take.
All right, so under in 2010 there was the Arab Spring, and this was in a whole lot of Islamic countries in the region, starting with a man who burned himself in Tunisia, and um, this led to revolutions in many countries. Many of these revolutions now have been proven unsuccessful, but I'll get to that in a second. The revolution in Syria, well, Syria has been under martial rule um, before the revolution for 48 years, and that's under the Assad's his father, and him as well, Bashar al-Assad, who's the president now. Um, so the revolution in Syria, or the Arab Spring, began a little bit later than than in the other countries. It was more of a delayed reaction, only because the media and internet and communications are so suppressed in Syria compared to many of these other more open countries at the time. So basically, there was there was dissent. There was dissent at soccer matches. There was dissent in the street. He put it down. Long story short, because I could literally explain this issue for hours before we even started talking about our policy differences on it. There was there was the differences where the Assad regime, who wanted to keep power over the country, and the Free Syrian Army, who supported democracy and the democratic um, overthrow of the government in the end. To and basically everything has devolved from there, with ISIS getting into the mix, the Al Nusra Front, the Syrian army, many regional players, and Russia getting into the mix as well. Now, how has the Obama administration dealt with it? The Obama administration, they have had, well, at first, this was early on in the crisis. They were supportive of the Free Syrian Army and other moderate rebel groups, training them and providing tactical support for them, but not really giving them any, and supplying them weapons, but not really giving them any soldier assistance. But what ended up happening a lot was that the Free Syrian Army was a coalition of moderate rebel groups, but not they didn't necessarily all have the same. They all wanted basically the same endgame, but they didn't really all have the same means and the same goals within that. So there was factions within it, and because of those factions within that group, um, other more unified and more extreme groups like the Al Nusra Front, who's affiliated with Al Qaeda, and eventually ISIS were able to rise. And because they prevented a unified military front and they were organized and they were disciplined, they were able to draw some fighters who really at the who although they might not have necessarily agreed with the hardline tactics of the groups they joined, they did want to fight the Syrian government through them, and some of them may have agreed. So that's one reason why those groups grew stronger, while the Free Syrian Army grew weaker. And then the Obama, I believe it was in 2013, I believe it could have been 2014. Correct me if I'm wrong. He called ISIS the JV squad in Syria and said Assad is the real person that we have to worry about. And he also said that
He
there
said
would be
something along the lines like you can wear a Lakers jersey, but that doesn't mean you're Kobe Bryant in the context of talking about ISIS and calling them a JV team.
right. And then he also said that if they found out there was chemical weapons used on civilians in Syria, that would be a red line. And a year later, after saying that, Assad
Cross the line.
he did a sarin gas attack. He initiated that, killing 1,400 civilians. And Obama did, and many people were mad at Obama because he did not put boots on the ground. He did after that initiate airstrikes, but again,
Yeah.
I would agree that was
So
the worst foreign policy moment of his
so
presidency because it really made him look like a fool, to be honest.
and this is where I
Uh,
feel like
but we're not really talking. We're talking about ideas for the future, and
yes, but I think this is a
that.
huge part, and this is where I feel like I might. This is where I am. Some parts of Obama's presidency I don't mind, but some parts infuriate me. And one thing that he was, besides calling him the JV team, the way he handled this issue, he it's he's supposedly his first three secretaries of defense, Robert M. Gates, Leon E. Panetta, and Chuck Hagel, all accused the Obama White House of micromanaging the military and forcing their foreign policy on the military and didn't give the military much wiggle room in how to deal with this issue. Um, and then Obama also, it's arguable that he completely changed the way U.S. is fighting wars with the initiation of drone strikes and airstrikes and having these drone bases built in Eastern Africa and the Middle East.
100% agree with you. And I also want to add, because I believe this is important for the whole context of the issue, is that at the same time this was happening, there was also a pretty large anti-war sentiment, considering had we had screwed up in Iraq, we had screwed,
Yes.
screwed up in Afghanistan. One of
Yeah.
Obama's initiatives was to pull troops out of both places.
And he did for sure.
Did, but then now at the end he left some troops in both places, considering the fighting's gotten worse. But it's also important to note because that's when, and I'm not a defense for it at all, because I think like you have to take every war issue by issue.
Yes. But and I
You can't say, look, I'm going to pull troops out of everywhere when one situation might need troops. But that is the larger context of the issue, that one reason he was micromanaging the military was because he wanted to pull troops out.
and it was
For
a very sticky
better,
situation because
for
of the
better or
way
worse.
George W. Bush handled the Iraqi war. And I think that's where a lot of this anti-war sentiment comes from, and
Right, and
not
and
putting troops on the ground comes from the fact that we fought a war that was so what's so
almost even,
controversial.
almost even, yeah. I was that's a way to put it, where we don't have to get into the merits of that war right
Yeah, no,
now.
no, but that's where the sentiment comes from the left and the right, of people
And
just being skeptical of is it worth putting troops on the ground.
and people were very supportive of Obama's initiative to take troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes,
Although they and in the most recent polls about whether to put troops on the ground against ISIS and in Syria, it's a split. It's very interesting. 42% of people favor ground troops. So that's just interesting to note.
and he left his presidency with about 5,000 troops in Afghanistan and
Yeah,
500 troops in Syria.
right,
And
right. 500 troops in Syria are more special ops,
yeah.
while 5,000 in Afghanistan, or while they're not just regular infantry, they're more so than the other soldiers in Syria
Yeah.
who are there to provide tactical support too.
So this is where I lie on this approach towards Obama's approach towards foreign policy and the way we've been handling ISIS and Syria in the Middle East. Um, I think if airstrikes, I think the incentive and the goal behind airstrikes was to do damage and fight the war without putting troops on the ground. Now, if that worked, I think it's a brilliant idea. But some statistics say that these drone and airstrikes have about a 10% success rate, and 90% of fatalities come. There's 90% are missing and cause thousands of lives in collateral damage. Now that does not sound good to me at all. And when you do that, to me, it makes it look like the U.S. wants to get involved, but also shows how little they want to get involved in the same time. And through this strategy, in my eyes, it makes the U.S. look like a laughing stock to these Middle Eastern countries such as Iran and these terrorist groups like ISIS, and gives them a stronger foothold and gives them more confidence to do these attacks that they did in France, in Paris, in Nice, in Belgium, etc.
All right, so I think this is interesting you say that because I think, and you're going to definitely agree with me on this, that our country, for better or worse, and I think definitely for better, but for other people may not view it this way, we have more scruples than than most of these Middle Eastern countries. And I mean, excluding Israel, but a lot of people in these governments, like say the Iran government, who's a sponsor of terrorism, um, and 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 Saudi Arabia, the same, and even even Turkey, who although they're secular, they're now having a crackdown on their government.
Yeah.
They they are not afraid to see people die as 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 long as they get their end game,
Mm-hmm.
as we are in the U.S. I mean the public, because we
Yeah.
don't know what the government's doing behind our back. So I'm sure you'll agree with me on that because, and also there's another thing I do want to point out, and that's that I think that we should delineate between the ISIS ground force and the ISIS um, foreign outreach force. Because not like to make a huge difference between them, but the difference between them is that they're the reason why ISIS is so dangerous to America is the reason why we hate ISIS so much is because it's one of its aims is to attack America. Even though, and I believe the facts on this, in 2015, um, Assad killed 15,748 people in Syria. 12,000 of them were civilians. ISIS killed 2,100 people in Syria. Only 1,366 were civilians.
Oh, and
But what I'm saying here is that the reason why, if you were just looking at those facts alone, you'd say Assad is much worse.
yeah.
But then the equalizer on that makes ISIS just as bad or even worse than Assad in many people's eyes is that ISIS also openly hates America, and they have plotted and they have supported attacks and claimed attacks on U.S. soil.
Yes.
So I just want to make that clear because the ISIS in Syria can't really can't really hurt America, but it's their outreach that really does hurt America.
And I mean, it's just the goal of your usual radical Islamist group. But I think that my the reason I want this thing to be solved over anything else is because of the humanitarian issue, right? And I believe it is a humanitarian issue that these people have lost their homes, and I think they deserve to have their home back. So it's not just a war against ISIS, but it's also a war and battle against Assad, because I think he's also just as evil. And because how can we as the Western world accept a leader who tear gasses his own people and then denies it? It's absurd.
So now,
That's why I think there needs to be a.
I want to ask you a question here because
Go ahead.
you haven't really laid out a clear view yet, even though you sort of keep talking about it. What is your preferred? All right, in a perfect world, what is your preferred end game in Syria, and how do you want that to happen? Let's just
Okay.
cut
So
right to.
I've been alluding to the fact that I believe that um airstrikes is a is not an efficient way to to battle these groups, because they're first off extremely ineffective, and they end up killing civilians. And although the Iraqi war, I'm against the merits of it. ISIS is larger than Al Qaeda ever was. And I believe a key reason to that, this is my opinion, is because at least during the time Al Qaeda was around, we had U.S. troops on the ground fighting with the people of the nations that we were in. Right now, it's very indirect. We give a little bit. We used to, at first, we gave tactical help, gave weapons, and then had maybe 500 special troops on the ground, and then did majority of airstrikes. I don't think that's effective. My view on how to solve this issue, or the beginning of solving this issue, is putting trained U.S. soldiers on the ground side by side with these rebels, having them being trained, but also having support of our troops, and having the U.S. soldiers take the lead in this,
So
and
you
having
support. So just to reiterate, you support training the rebels. You just said.
I support training the rebels, but it's the U.S. soldiers taking the lead and the rebels following, not us. Does that make a
All
more
right.
direct approach of helping them by them following us, not us just teaching them and then ditching and leaving and then dropping airstrikes?
All right. So then, what do you want after this is all over? Assuming. All
So
right.
then the next question
Assuming.
is, if ISIS is defeated and Syria and that part is done, I believe, if I don't know if ISIS can be defeated, because as long as the radical ideals are there, I think it's more of just a suppression of that and a containing of that. So I believe if you can limit that, and if the U.S. puts their foot on the ground and says, "Listen, we're the strongest nation in the world. You cannot mess with us," which I don't. I think under the Obama administration, he did the complete opposite, and I think he allowed room for them to trample on us. I think it shows a message not only to ISIS and other terrorist groups, but it sends a message to Assad as well. But the problem is, we've had countries where we've killed the leader, such as in Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi was killed, and then we try to instate democracy, and then it just goes to shambles.
And
So,
Saddam Hussein.
and Saddam, so there needs to be a transition process. It can't just go straight to direct democracy. And this is the issue that we have with trying to enforce democracy on these countries that are just not used to it. There needs to be a transition process. Now, I don't know exactly how that's done, but I do know for sure you can't just go straight to direct democracy, because once you do that and then you leave again, it's just going to be a new terrorist group that comes out again.
All right. Interesting view. All right. So here's what you made a statement that ISIS is more dangerous than Al Qaeda ever was. Which, by the way, I just
I,
want to.
I said I said ISIS is larger than Al Qaeda ever was, not more dangerous.
Okay. Because I just do want to let you know because you said everything was under control while we were fighting Al Qaeda, and meanwhile, they been they were launching attacks against our forces, IEDs um and ambushes in Iraq, and and even in Africa they've started to launch more attacks both in Sudan and West Africa in coordination with um other local groups there. So I just want to make that point because we have on ISIS
I
we have.
more meant that the size and the power of the group was contained more
But that's all
than
right.
ISIS.
Okay, because we have this um thing that we learn in psychology called the availability heuristic, where when uh, you usually will take, even though facts may support otherwise, people will take the first emotionally jarring case that they hear and they'll hang on to it. And this happens in criminal cases. This happens all the time. Um, in politics.
All right. So what is the fact that
So
you're?
my point here is that we need, and ISIS is terrible. I totally agree, but we need to treat it. We need to try to look at this whole situation with and take our emotions out of it because, all right, because if we allow ourselves just to fight ISIS, which I agree that we do need to fight ISIS, but if we just fight them because they've put out attacks on U.S. soil, what we're gonna get is we're gonna get a worsening of anti-U.S. Sentiment in the Middle East, if that's even possible, and we're going to get a region that's not fixed because the Syrian government will still be putting out refugees and still fighting their own war. Because I want to make this point. Assad in the beginning funded ISIS. He funded ISIS, and you could argue this is because he wanted an enemy to have a justified enemy to fight against. or you can argue that he thought maybe they would take care of the civilians that he wanted to kill.
Uh-huh.
But there's a lot more than people say. Assad is directly fighting ISIS. There's a lot of under the table connections
No,
between.
I agree with that. I
And
don't
so
think it's as clear cut as it is made to be.
here's what. All right, so I definitely see where you're coming from. Here's my plan in my view on the whole issue. I believe, and this is a controversial issue that I didn't even realize Donald Trump supported it, but I did look it up and I found out he did, and that is to use U.S. forces to carve out safe areas for civilians and refugees in Syria and Iraq. And that's, I think, first and foremost. And I mean, I know that would create large refugee camps, but I think that.
So he's proposing to use soldiers to make safe refugee camps for these people.
Well, at refugee areas, and just all
Okay.
right. So let me just continue for a second,
Okay.
because at the time, right now, and throughout this whole war, Assad has restricted aid groups from getting into civilian areas.
Yes. Okay.
And so that's one of the hugest issues here because, and he's obviously attacked civilians and used them as shields in the fighting.
Uh-huh.
So I think the biggest issue because look, if you have Assad fighting ISIS, and no civilians involved, isn't that almost a win-win? Because those are two deplorable organizations fighting each other. But then, because then this is interesting, we supported a lot of moderate rebels in Syria. And Russia, which I know we swore not to talk about this today, but with the help of Assad, they wiped out a lot of the moderate rebels that we supported. So they turned it into a conflict of Assad versus ISIS for the most part, which is a lose-lose situation for the U.S. So
But keep in mind what led to Russia and Iran intruding into this issue so much.
I mean the U.S.'s weakness.
In my view, it was U.S.'s weakness and under the Obama administration backing off in this issue allowed Iran and
Okay, but
Russia to
all
really
right, but
come
you
into
all
play.
right. That
Would
that I
Would you agree
agree.
with that?
That I
Let's.
agree with. But
Okay.
Dave,
Okay. I
we're
just
not
wanted.
talking. But Dave, we're not talking about that. You told me you wanted to do this episode specifically because you wanted to know my plan for the
Yes.
future
Yes. All right.
and
I just wanted to.
act. So I believe that first we should carve out safe areas with refugee camps to have aid organizations getting there. And secondly, I believe that we should support Kurdistan. And I know that this is another politically fraught issue because Turkey does not like the Kurds, and Turkey is one of our most important allies in the Middle East. But at the same time, the Kurds have wanted to fight ISIS and have wanted to fight many of these bad radical groups of their own volition because they have their own motives, which is an autonomous land in Kurdistan. So if they are willing to do some of the dirty work in fighting ISIS, I say let's go for it. But then again, of course, you have the different types of Kurds, and there's the radical Kurdish, which is the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Then you have the Kurdish Regional Government, the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, which is in place with Barzani as the leader. Öcalan is the leader of the radical PKK, who, by the way, have killed Kurdish civilians who don't agree with their radical views and have been proven to have been smuggling narcotics. So again, but as you said earlier to me, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and I believe Kurdistan is a much better alternative than ISIS or Assad in Syria.
Okay.
And now, secondly, so what should the U.S. do? I believe that, as you said before, the fight against ISIS will never truly be done because their ideology has spread to Malaysia, it spread to Thailand, it spread to Libya, it spread to Africa. But what I really do think is that, and I know, look, I know that this could be a controversial view, but I really don't care, in that we need to fight ISIS on the internet. If they can't have, and on their connections, if they can't have outreach, they're not going to be able to sustain a movement. We got to cut off the tentacles at the base of them. And so, because look, even if ISIS doesn't have any territory at all in Syria or Iraq, if they still have connections, they could still carry on attacks throughout the world and still inspire attacks throughout the world. So it's not even, and obviously I know they've committed genocide against the Yazidis, and I know that they've repressed the people who have been under them. But at the same time, what as the U.S. what we are worried about is the proliferation of ISIS-style attacks and ISIS-style ideology throughout the world. So we need to cut it off at the tentacles, and that if that means Facebook having to shut down any pro ISIS pages or Twitter, and then they should go for that because I I don't think there's any room for that in any free speech debate in our country. And I agree that we should keep and to fight now to directly fight Assad and ISIS. I agree that we should directly keep the airstrikes, but unlike you, I don't think that we should have U.S. forces leading the way. I think that we should have special ops teams and not many soldiers. We should, if we have 500 now, I don't know. I'm not one to say we should have an exact number of soldiers and say I wouldn't say increase it to 1,000 or anything, but
Okay.
I agree that we should have special ops organizations who not organizations soldiers who have specific tactical objectives, whether that's to I don't know assassinate a high level member of the Syrian government or to take out a strategic objective so that civilians can be in a safer position. Then I think that's what we should do because look, in the end, if we put a crazy amount of boots on the ground here and fight both Assad and ISIS, and let's just say we wipe both of them out. What's the end game there? We have a U.S. led coalition government in Syria. How is that different from Iraq?
All right, wait. Okay.
We aren't
So
we aren't
I need
gonna,
to can I address a few things that you said
yeah.
first because you said a lot of things that I want to address. So you first off you said you want the U.S. troops to build refugee camps near Syria and
I
have
said that
safe.
I said establish safe areas
Okay, establish
which
safe
which
areas
civilians can go to.
in Syria.
Yeah, and if that means using force, that means using force.
You have to use force, and I think
Yes, but I agree that
that directly leads into conflict with ISIS soldiers and the Assad government because the whole we tried the we've tried to have these 24-hour grace periods to get in, and we've had what maybe 3 or 4 successful ones. If you put if you try to build a safe haven within the country, there's going to be constant warfare surrounding it all times, and I think that leaves no choice but to lead into conflict and war between that's a three-way war it seems because you're going to have Assad people against you for protecting the people and ISIS as well because as you said it seems like Assad and ISIS have a greater connection than it's made out to be. So
but even if
I
they are
think that forces you to put troops on the ground.
all right,
And
so
my other thing is, what difference does a safe haven make if it's in a war? Isn't a safe haven better to be in a refugee camp in Turkey or in Europe than being in a safe haven in the middle of a war zone? To
all
me,
right,
that just doesn't make sense.
let me articulate myself here.
Okay.
Because when I've read Trump's proposal and what I meant to really say was a safe exit from these places and then into a place of Syria, let's just say near the Israeli border where there's less fighting
Okay.
there, where they can remain in their
But
country.
what difference does
Because
that? Okay, it gives you a safe exit, but I still don't think
here's the
that
thing.
solves the issue of these people having their home back. And then, all
Okay,
right, let me address a little bit. Let me address another thing that you said.
well you just attacked me. Let me just address
Okay, go
that.
ahead. Go ahead.
Address that quickly because whether or not I want to state this in broad terms because what you're suggesting is that we lead the way to somehow fight ISIS and Assad on a three-way front, and then come out on top, which would mean using excessive force because neither of the two are gonna like our presence there, and they're both gonna fight us. And then somehow, if we win, having a coalition government there, who is going to have to restore everything, and we don't want to be in the
But
process of
wait,
nation building.
I didn't bring that up yet. I'm gonna bring that up later. But I was just addressing the safe havens part first before anything else.
I don't understand, but you say that leaving, you say that
I'm
using,
just saying,
saying
compared
that
to
putting
all the
force,
refugees that are flooding, if you provide them a safe exit, that still doesn't solve the issue of making Syria a sustainable area for these people to come back to. And
but
I
that's
think that just adds to the temporary solution of giving them safe space, which is good. I think that's fine. But then, so we can, I would agree with that. But I don't know, that just encourages this temporary solution.
okay.
And
But
then,
and then I went into what I thought the permanent solution was after that.
yes, and so you say we need to fight ISIS on the internet.
And I say using special ops forces
And
with specific
because
objectives.
you made the claim that even if you get rid of them, the idea is still there, so they can still have influence. Okay, I would say there is still influence there, but if you don't have a core, if you don't have a strong group, and you don't see these murders on the internet and see these beheadings and see,
Exactly, you won't see them on the internet because you stop seeing that on the internet under
but
my.
as long I don't know what the statistic is, but a lot of these terrorist organizations put things on the, it's called the deep web, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how you block the deep web.
Well, you'd have to again come up with a strategy. I mean,
And that
we
seems to
just
me, it
saw.
just seems a little bit, it seems a little bit far-fetched, because you already have a huge group, a centralized group, and people already around the world already know about ISIS. So I don't know if that's really, if you continue these airstrikes that have a 10% accuracy rate and continue to kill civilians, and then just block ISIS sites on the internet.
But Dave, it's
I
not
don't
just
know if that's going to solve
sites.
the issue.
We saw what the CIA is capable of in this first WikiLeaks revelation in the last couple of days.
Okay.
I think it's beyond their capability to somehow hack into ISIS's, even if their main web and their deep web capabilities to contact people all over the world. Because think about it, if you live in a place like, let's say, Turkey
Okay.
or even the U.S.
All right.
where
So tell me, what is it
or
gonna
even the
because
U.S. You and the internet right now gives you direct ability
okay,
to contact an ISIS recruiter
okay,
in the Middle East.
all
But
right.
that's suddenly cut off, and then suddenly you're hearing all this around you. You're hearing all this pro-U.S. stuff because that's on the normal. That's on the norm for living in the U.S. Then you're probably not going to commence attack against the U.S. But if you're able to get recruited and talk to a recruiter in the Middle East, then suddenly they can brainwash you. They can brainwash you, and that's how we have lone
But
wolf.
it's not just groups. It's there's plenty of terrorist organizations, and they all derive their main philosophy. Whether this is a controversial statement or not, I would say all of these radical Islamic groups
Okay.
form with their philosophy based on words from the Quran taken out of context. Is that an incorrect statement? Whether it's Al Qaeda, whether it's ISIS,
I think
the
the argument.
basis
I think the argument,
they use Islam.
Dave. I think what you're trying to say is all these what you were saying before is all these organizations have a territorial basis. Is that not what you were trying to say?
They have a territorial basis, but I'm saying eliminating ISIS that does not eliminate radical Islamic groups, and that people can still do random terrorist attacks whether they belong to a group or not. Now, ISIS makes it easier,
So
but
how is putting U.S. boots on the ground to fight in Syria and to fight? There are supporters of ISIS and there are supporters of the Assad regime, both of
because
which are Muslim,
when
both
you
of which
see the U.S.,
are
who is
Sunni.
known to be a world power and doesn't take nonsense like this, put do action and put troops on the ground and actually start eliminating these groups and threatening them, and not just dropping these drones and
That'll
killing the
radicalize
occasion.
more terrorists.
What?
That'll radicalize more terrorists.
How do you, where do you come up with that formulation?
We go into Iraq.
Okay.
People resent our presence there as almost like an occupier,
Okay, but these people,
and then
the Middle
suddenly
East doesn't,
now
you
we
made
have
the point.
ISIS. Now
You
we have
made the
ISIS.
point,
All
they
these
can't
troops
hate us
invading the
anymore.
U.S.
You made that point.
So basically, what you're suggesting here is that the only way to root out radical Islamic terrorism is to literally put so many U.S. forces on the ground is that you literally eliminate all of the people who could potentially be radical Islamic
All right,
terrorists.
let me make another point then. Since
That's
nine
not feasible.
from nine okay, since 9/11, right? When we started to put troops on the ground to fight, okay, it didn't have to do with 9/11, but we were still fighting Al Qaeda. And under the Bush administration after 9/11, after putting troops on the ground, how many terrorist attacks happened on U.S. soil compared under the Obama administration when we laid off ISIS and started going through his foreign policy?
All right, but I don't see your connection here because ISIS didn't exist under the Bush administration.
But there were other terrorist groups, is what I'm saying. But we were
But they
putting
weren't.
troops on the ground to fight them.
But they weren't. All right, I see what you're saying.
You see, I'm just saying
You're
when
saying
you
here
show
that
strength, it makes it a lot more. It seems like when you show strength, even if it's not the group you're fighting directly, it gives a sense that these are people you don't want to mess with.
I just want to say this is interesting because interesting you say that because there was not in Bush's it is almost comparing apples to oranges because in Bush's administration compared to Obama's there was not nearly the social media reach that there was now because at that time
You're right. You're right. You're
you probably
absolutely right.
need to
But you know
coordinate
what?
an attack through cell phones which could be wiretapped or you could
Wait. You're right. There was no technology yet. We had 9/11 happen without social media because where do these people derive their ideals from, whether there is technology or not? From Islamic doctrine that they take out of context.
no but to make your point before your assertion here is that when we occupy terrorists in their on their home front, then there won't be any attacks
I
on
didn't
foreign.
say there won't be, but I think it
There
gives
has
fear.
been. All right, let's just say there hasn't been.
Okay.
But that's sort. You're saying that there will be fewer because that's the
Yes.
point you're making right now.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting because there has been the Al Qaeda. It was never it's never its goal to fight the U.S. on a purely. All right, ISIS has a doomsday scenario, which is like the U.S. is fighting them and this is life or death. I believe Al Qaeda's philosophy is more like obviously we hate the U.S., but at the same time we don't want it to mess with our stuff. And obviously 9/11 was an offensive attack, but that's also a response to our. I mean, and this is not to justify it by any stretch of the imagination, to our involvement in Iran, in Iraq, in the Iran-Iraq war, and with Saddam Hussein over the years. People resent our presence, and your assertion that when people are occupied in their homeland, they'll attack less is totally irrelevant now because if Al Qaeda couldn't get to people on through a Twitter DM in 2002, and now they and which ISIS can do now, how will attacking ISIS on this home front stop someone from contacting someone in the U.S.
The
and starting an
contact.
attack?
Okay, the contact can still be there, but I still firmly there was still social media under the towards the end of the Bush administration. It wasn't to the extent
Twitter
it
was
is now,
there.
but it still
Twitter
was
was
there.
there, and it was MySpace, and Facebook was just getting started. I mean,
In
yes, there was.
2000 in 2007 it was.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yes, that's
But
the
I was going to
there
make the
was, but
argument terrorist groups have functioned without the internet for centuries. Terrorism has been around without internet for centuries, and there's been humongous groups and humongous acts of terror for centuries without the use of the internet. So I don't know if that's a valid argument
but
because as long as the ideals are there and you don't need the internet and you can read it from a book and take it for context for yourself, it doesn't matter who you're fighting for, and that's what allows these terrorist groups to form. But if they see a force on the outside suppressing that and containing that and say, we are not going to let that happen and we're not going to let this grow, I think it allows a fear to happen. And I think stepping back, here's another question. You'd rather keep inaccurate airstrikes that kill civilians than put more troops on the ground. You want to keep basically, you want to keep what Obama's been doing. Have special
I
ops
want more
forces.
special ops, and
Okay.
I think the
But
airstrike.
what do more special ops missions do? Because obviously you can kill a leader like Saddam Hussein and it doesn't have that much of an impact. People have said that. That's the argument. You can kill a leader of a terrorist organization, but the ideal and the philosophy is still there. So, and most of these special op organizations are here to kill the leaders of these groups.
All right, here's where I think we're differing because you keep telling me what we need to do to fight terrorists, but you never say how we're going to be fighting them. You say put all these boots on the ground. Who are they going to be fighting, Dave? They're going to be fighting who? Assad and ISIS
Well,
simultaneously, correct?
I'm not a military strategist,
Well, this is
but
what
I
we're
know
talking
that we
about.
have the
Who are they going to be
largest and
fighting?
strongest army in the world, and I don't think the strength of these people compared to our military and what we're capable of. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, but at the same
Okay.
time,
So
we
that's
at the same time we as a country, and I'm sure This is what's
And
going through
I don't think we need to
the
put
mind of many military
150,000
strategists
troops
is
on the
that we
ground
don't
like we did in
we don't
Iraq.
we don't want to enmesh ourselves in another war that has no direct impact on our
It
either.
does. It has direct
Yes,
impact.
with the
Yes.
refugees, obviously I know
Okay,
that,
so if these
but at
people
the
want to
same
take in
time,
these refugees, it absolutely affects our country.
yes, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
It doesn't affect our country. What I am saying is that it has no impact on, as of right now, on the majority of U.S. citizens, and this is not.
Exactly, but at one point it will because we're not coming up with a strategy to defeat ISIS and all
So
these
Dave, I
refugees
keep
are
asking you
flowing
this.
out.
What's your end game? What's your end game? Do you
Okay,
want a
I'm not a
Syria?
military I'm not a military strategist.
But then why are
Right?
we talking about this? Do you want a
Because
Syria free
because
of
I
ISIS and
believe okay,
Assad?
I don't have a specific where are we going to put troops and what's going to but
No, I'm saying who are we gonna fight in Syria, Dave?
who are we going to fight in Syria? Okay. So we've made the connection between Assad and ISIS.
Yeah, but
Am I
we made the connection,
Wait.
but they still are fighting each other. I want to
Okay,
make that clear.
but there is a connection.
They,
And
they
my
there was a
argument
connection at the
was
beginning. It's unclear if there's a connection now, but there was at the beginning.
okay. My argument was that you choose I'm not once I say you choose one group that does the most damage, and if you're concerned with the US interests and the interests of the Western world, you choose ISIS as your number one enemy first.
Now, I find that interesting for you to say
But
that,
for the
because
humanitarian crisis, you pick Assad because he's the one that's killed more people and is killing his own people, which is absolutely absurd as a leader.
so what do you want?
And then I say you choose ISIS, and if you prove to Assad and you show him what the U.S. military is capable of, and I would hope that the Western Europe also wakes up and stops doing this because it's not just the U.S. When Paris got attacked, they just dropped drones. Same thing with Nice and in as well. And once again, I think it's a very bad strategy because I don't think it does much. So if it was just if NATO or just the Western Europe united against ISIS and made the statement as sorry, as the Western world, we are against radical Islam and are against these terrorist groups, and it's not just the U.S. I think it shows Assad, he's alone here.
How is he alone? Russia's on his side, um, and by fighting ISIS, we'll be fighting his number one enemy. So we'll be implicitly supporting him and wiping out his enemy, because it's the fighting right now is loosely Assad versus ISIS, and then civilians are caught in the middle, obviously. And when I find what I find ironic in your statement is you say, you know this obviously affects U.S. interests because there's the refugees, and the refugees are coming into our country, and this is
Yeah,
why we talked about this in the first place.
yeah.
Assad has killed more than 500,000 people, created between 5 and 9 million refugees. Now, I just want to, that's a huge amount of number. So, going by your standards of doing this just to
But it's
help
not
us,
just him
but
himself.
listen,
It's
but
his
it's his
argument. It's war
government,
with ISIS.
but doing it by your standards of just um, promoting our interest to have refugees not flooding anymore, you'd want to fight ISIS. I mean, not you'd want to fight Assad because Assad is creating more refugees. But but then you're saying let's fight ISIS. And if you fight ISIS, then what you're giving license to do is you beat ISIS. Okay, that's good. That's great.
Okay.
Then you have Assad, who still wants to crack down against all of his unloyal citizens. You will have no one left in Syria because he's tortured his own citizens. He does hate the West. He's targeted civilians. He's targeted journalists. He does
Yeah.
not let aid organizations in. He
Okay.
barrel bombs his own civilians. He gasses his own civilians.
Yes.
Your support and you're killing. You're implicitly supporting him. The only way, if you're gonna put
No, but that's not what
if you're
I'm.
putting boots on the ground, the only way to fight him is to do an all-out offensive against both of them, or else, because if you do anything else, you're just enmeshing yourself for the long haul in this conflict that's never gonna end. And if you
So
do it,
you would
but
rather.
if you do it the other way, you let them fight each other. And while it's not a morally great position to take because people are still dying on both sides, you're not supporting one terrible
But
regime.
you letting them fight each other never lets the conflict end. I mean, it's been going on now for what,
The
5 years?
way you're doing it would have Assad as the leader of Syria, and that's terrible.
At first, first. I say
And
you
then what?
handle ISIS
He's not
first.
gonna back down. Russia's literally they're hand in hand.
I don't know if they're hand in hand. Why do you?
Why do I say there's hand in hand?
Yeah.
Russia has bombed U.S. supported forces in Syria. That's first. Russia's bombed moderate rebels. Russia and Assad, I mean Putin and Assad have had meetings and have had public shows of support for each other.
Okay.
And Putin, even when Assad's been ostracized by the international community, Putin's been the only major leader to come
And
to a.
then this is where I bring this up again. What I brought this up earlier, and I hope you don't get mad when I say this, but what led to Russia stepping in the first place?
But
And
that's not all
we
right. I
wait,
understand.
but wait
I
a
understand.
second.
But
You okay? If you understand, but wait, what let Russia and Iran step into this and take control of this conflict was us backing down and doing what you said: special op forces and dronings.
Steve,
If
we
we
we can't go back in time.
yes we
If it was
but
back
here's what I'm you can you
if it was
change
back in time before Russia was involved in this, I would have said let's fight. Before even
But
ISIS
you
was
don't
involved,
think that
I would have
sends a
said let's
message to
fight
Russia
Assad.
either? You don't think it sends a message to Russia? Putin's been stepping all over us.
How does that send a message to Russia?
If you fight Assad and you fight ISIS and you're actually doing
You
something,
just said not to fight Assad. You said just to
first you
fight.
fight ISIS, and I think it sends a message not only to Assad but his allies as well, because the U.S. has taken such a step back. I mean, if we want to take that foreign policy approach and step back altogether, okay, but that allows countries like Russia and Iran to become stronger. Now, I
Dave,
still think there's time for to turn it back, and if you put troops on the ground, it sends a message. You don't if you believe if you believe that Obama stepping back in foreign policy allowed Russia to come in, who says the US stepping in won't force Russia to back out or at least realize that there's still a world power out there that was the ones that fought them in the Cold War and won the Cold War essentially and put their foot on the ground and said we're not going to let Russia take over the world and do this.
because we will be supporting Russia's interests. That's why. Because we will be everything you said is true, and it would be true if we were fighting Assad. But because you support to fight ISIS, which Russia also supports, by the way, then by association we will be helping Russia. And you know what's interesting? You say this because the issue used to be a little bit more cut and dry before ISIS was thrown into the mix, and that's that Assad was killing his own civilians. And at the time, I mean, there was obviously anti-war sentiment in the U.S., but I don't know why, when the red line could have been crossed, we didn't take stronger actions. I agree then, but now what you're looking at is if you attack ISIS and you say that'll send a message to Assad and Russia,
Yeah.
all that the message that will send to them is we're on your side here, buds. We're on your
No,
side.
we're clearing out one enemy, so then we're going to fight you guys next. And it's
How
easy to say for any country to say you're against ISIS when you just drop drones and like do it from a distance and say I don't want to put my foot in the water, but I want to make it seem like it because in my view that's what droning is. So anybody can say they're against ISIS, but
all right,
to put your to do the walking and the talking in my opinion is something completely different and it sends a message to the world.
all right, Dave, you're all over the place because you're you're supporting. All right, you're
How am I
saying
all over the place? Explain this.
all right. You're saying first of all, our policies against ISIS have contributed to a 1/3 um percentage loss on their territory, which if you don't, I mean, it may not seem
No,
like
that
a,
is true. I know
but
that their
that is
territory is
true.
shrunk, but I don't know
Now,
if their influence has
now,
shrunk.
second of all, you say let's fight. You say let's fight ISIS. That's the main objective. Which, all right, I can see where you're coming from. They directly threaten the U.S., but at the same time, you say somehow that will that will show Russia and that will show Syria that we're committed to fighting them in the future. But I can't get how you're conflating helping Syria, helping Assad retain his power by fighting their main enemy at the time, and helping Russia because their objective is to get rid of ISIS to help prop up Assad because they're their supporter in the Middle East. I don't get that how that sends them a message of yeah, we're gonna fight you. If anything, that sends a message of
Okay.
we're taking a strategic look at this. We're gonna fight ISIS, which is what you want, and basically you're also saying that you think that the best way to get rid of, and this is one reason why you're all over the place, that the best reason to help get the best end game in Syria, which will help refugees come back to their land, is by clearing all of them out. But by clearing ISIS out and not clearing Assad out, Assad hates the civilians more than ISIS does. So that'll just make it even harder for refugees to
Okay,
come back.
I can see where you. Okay, I can see where you're coming from. In that Assad is just as big of a issue as ISIS, maybe bigger. And I propose that, in my eyes, if you fight ISIS and actually do something to start off, it sends a message to these other two powers. But
But why?
because we've been cowardly and we've been stepping back and doing absolutely nothing.
But using force at all for in just any
And if
way,
anything, the
without any
war
reason,
strategy is
doesn't
helping Assad
it doesn't.
because 10% of our drones are accurate and the collateral damage is killing the civilians he wants to kill. So, in essence, our foreign policy is almost helping Assad reach his goal. And now here's my issue, Adam. What you proposed, I just don't. How long is it gonna take for your plan to work? You're proposing the Assad and ISIS fight each other and then cut off ISIS's influence on the internet while they still have a strong influence in that area and connections, but it's going to decrease their influence in other places around the world, but they're still centralized where they are. How is this going to solve the issue? When
And
is
the issue
Syria
here.
going to be a safe space where people can live there again with your strategy?
All right, so here's where I think you're misunderstanding me because my immediate concern is getting the remaining civilians in Syria to safety because right now they can't do anything. They are stuck in a vice grip between Russia and Assad and the Al Nusra Front, all the people there who are fighting each other, and they're non-combatants in this conflict. And obviously, more than 5 million have already fled, so I'm not really sure how many there really are left to flee. But at the same time, getting them to immediate safety is my goal, and if that means fighting through Mosul to have a half a mile line safe space, and that involves putting troops on the ground. That's fine, but I don't see how putting by putting a large ground force on the ground permanently in Syria will have any effect on and any positive effect on this fighting in the future because again you have to choose an enemy to fight, and if you fight both at the same time you'll be getting hit from both sides because and
But
so
answer my question. When is Syria going to be
I don't know. Do you want me to say what 2022? This war's been going. It's in seventh year now. I don't know a year. As
But do
I'm
you
not a
think
military
your
strat.
do you think your
How
your
is how
strategy
is
is going to stabilize it anytime soon?
all right? Here's it won't. Let's just say it takes another 5 years to stabilize, but we get the civilians out of the way first and foremost. Then you just have ISIS and Assad fighting each other. They weaken each other, or at the very least, maybe you get other regional powers in the mix so that U.S. doesn't have to do the bulk of this fighting,
Okay.
and then you can create a strategy in which you strategically and at that time maybe you look at that time and say, look, maybe we can fight Assad and maybe we can fight ISIS
Okay.
simultaneously.
Now, I think
But
that sounds good on paper.
when there's civilians in the middle, you can't
Yeah.
do it.
It sounds really good on paper to,
So
get
does
every
yours, Dave.
wait,
So
wait.
does yours.
Wait. It sounds very good on paper to get everybody out and wait for Assad and ISIS to weaken, and you gave an estimated time of 5 years, right?
I don't know. I
This
no. I
wait,
just said what.
I know. I'm just it doesn't.
I'm not making a
Okay,
time
I
up. It's
understand.
not a
I
stretch.
understand. I get it. But wait, this war's been going on for already what, 5 years? Correct?
More.
More. Okay. And what has already happened in Europe because of it? One of the arguably the biggest reason why Brexit has happened is because of the refugee crisis. When you look at the reason people voted to leave, is because they didn't want to follow the UN's policy of taking in refugees. And who knows what else is going to happen in Europe and what chaos or potential turmoil can happen. Would you say that's see, I would agree. If you could just get these people out and wait until they get weaker, sure, but there's an urgency here because a lot of cultural things and a lot of tension can rise in those 5 to 15 to 20 years while we wait for this Assad and ISIS thing to settle. And at that point, I think Europe will look like a completely different country demographically if it takes, up to 5 to 15 to 10 to 20 years.
So
So
Dave,
there's
I think it's
there's a
interesting
whole
because
another issue that gets tied in with that as well.
so when you just throw these U.S. forces at ISIS, and
I'm
then you
not
have
saying throw.
and
Wait. Here's the thing. You say I want to throw in a huge amount. right now we have 400 to 500 troops, and when we were in Iraq, we had 150,000. So there's a huge difference there between the amount of troops. Now, I just think that we should give the Trump administration, I think I think Donald Trump should be giving these military generals much more leeway and not micromanage the way they did. And if they come up with a strategy that involves putting boots on the ground that can even fight ISIS and Assad at the same time, and it's a just even if you just give it a try,
Dave,
because
that's sort of not what you said before. You're sort of softening up your
I'm
views.
softening up now.
You said before, Adam, don't you agree that the U.S. military is the strongest military in the world, and
Yes,
we should show Russia and Syria
yeah,
that and that.
yeah.
So you were basically agitating to put a lot of troops on the
No,
ground.
that's not what I was agitating at for all. I was not trying to mention that. I was saying
But now you're just
we
saying
have
we
the
should let
strongest military. No, no.
you're just
When I
saying we should
say
let
wait, no, no. When I say strongest military, it means we have some of the best equipment. I don't even know if that's true at this point anymore. Most trained troops, and we have a history of winning wars.
so we should put special ops and airstrikes is what
But
you're
that
saying.
doesn't work. No, no, that's not what I'm
But
saying.
then you're saying we should put a large ground force then.
I'm saying more than 500, but it doesn't have to be 150,000.
But then you want to show our power. You but but what I'm just struggling to grasp is here.
Okay,
You say look, we should let the Trump administration make a decision.
we should let.
That's after this hour discussion. That's the point you come to.
My point is no.
That's what you come to. Even after saying that we have the strongest military in the world,
I
and after
said we should
that
let the Trump. I
we need
think
to
the
fight
Trump.
ISIS and Assad, or no, we have to fight just ISIS, but but also send Assad a message that we should not put out a strong force on the ground, but somehow use our equipment to show them. I don't know.
No, when I say
That
we have
what
the
you
strongest military, it's the combination of having highly trained soldiers, a strong military, and a history of winning wars. And then we put that all aside, and then what we do is we have these special ops, and then we have these unsuccessful dronings and airstrikes that don't do anything. I think there's so much more that we
But they
could
do
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 that's
stuff as
not as
well. They
fast.
lost a third of their territory. ISIS leaders are on the run within their territory because they've been pinpointed, and they can't stay in one place for more than a couple days without having fear of an airstrike. That's that's a small victory in a larger war, but that's a pretty big deal.
So after they shrunk one third of their size after 7 years, and then 5 million
No,
refugees.
ISIS has been here for about a year and a half, 2 years, maybe yeah, about 2 years since they rose to prominence. They got huge in the power vacuum. We fought them, but we haven't thrown our full force against them because one, we don't obviously we've explained this before, but we don't want to empower Assad, and the ideology of ISIS will still spread, and we don't necessarily want to put U.S. boots on the ground again. That's a huge deal. Dave, would you be prepared right now to be drafted into the military to fight on your huge ground force that you'd want to fight in?
This is not to the extent where you need to have a military draft. I think you're going way out of line when you say something like that. We have 500 troops in that country. That's
But
it.
what's a
Why do you
number
need
you
a
want to? So
What?
you're gonna say I'm not a military strategist, but what's a number you want to see?
I don't know, but I don't know if we necessarily need 150,000.
Is
Like we could.
10,000 too many or too little? Is 20,000 too many or too little? Is 50,000 too many or too
Now,
little?
the skepticism comes from George W. Bush. The Iraqi war was a disaster, and American lives were essentially wasted, and the war was purposeless. Right? We can agree on that.
Basically, because it
Okay.
led to this vacuum.
And I think that's where the skepticism starts. But we talked about this kind of earlier today, and I just don't understand where this concept. If you sign up for the military, you're saying I'm willing to risk my life to fight for this country. And if it's planned well and strategized well, what's the
That's a
what?
pretty big if. But the second part of what you're saying there, and I hate to interrupt you, but you say you sign up to fight and protect this country.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people who fought in Iraq and who have fought in Afghanistan have seen, ISIS and Al Qaeda take back many of the
Mm-hmm.
gains that they fought so hard for,
Yes.
and seen the Taliban take back as soon as the U.S. leaves,
Yes.
take back all of the land that they lost their lives and they lost their brothers' lives for.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna you say we have to fight tactically smart, but and which I would say I 100% agree with,
Okay.
but at the same time if we let's just say which is what your end game is, put a large force on the ground to fight ISIS and to fight ISIS and eventually kill Assad. So what then? How do we know another group won't inhabit that vacuum, and then all the gains that we fought for are just gone?
That's a great question, and
Because
that's where
I think
the
if
that's where this is an even bigger debate is whether we should ever get involved in this or just let the Middle East become the disaster that it's destined to become.
well, I think if we're gonna do anything, we we need to be
Because
more.
you were
We
right,
need to.
Adam. You need if you're gonna clear out an area, if you're gonna destroy ISIS and you're gonna destroy Assad, it doesn't mean that you take troops out of the ground. And if you want to maintain the progress that you made and let these civilians live here and come back, you still need to suppress the radical Islamists and to some extent keep troops on the ground, which is essentially what we saw with the Obama administration. When we pulled troops out of the ground, the vacuum happened. Now that could have been prevented if we never, started the Iraqi war in the first place. But at this point, we're at a situation where it seems like to some extent you need to keep troops on the ground once you win the war.
But which is, it's a permanent occupying force of a country. But then, see, I think that our role as America in the world should be, in this situation particularly, should be more of a prodder than
Yes,
than a forcer, because
for sure.
the only way, and it doesn't even have to be democracy, but the
Yeah,
only way that a government that we support will happen in these nations. I mean, it could be a republic. I don't really know, but it has to be organically. And
I agree.
if we create this huge power vacuum and then insert this government, there will still be underlying sectarian violence between
And
Alawites and
yes, I
and
agree with you there.
and
And that's why I think
jihadists and
and
Shiites
and
and
that's why
Sunnis, and so by just taking them all out, you say we'll take them all out and people will return to their land, but it
but
won't be that
no, but
simple because
Adam,
they'll
I
still be fighting in the
that's
government.
why okay, this is we what I mentioned earlier is we can't do what we did with Libya and we can't do what we did with Iraq. We can't just put a democracy there and say, "All right, we did our job. We're out."
But then what do you want to do?
We try something different. Maybe put in what we did with Cuba, where we selected a dictator to rule, but set a limit. Maybe for 20 years you're going to have a because also the people in the Middle East, very few know democracy and understand it and have lived in it. So it's you kind of need to transition into a lifestyle like that because that's a very extreme transition. So even the people that are fighting for democracy don't necessarily know what they're doing once they have the chance for it.
But Dave, you're telling me that if the U.S. selects a dictator to rule over the
I'm
land
just
of
saying that's a
Iraq and
radical
Syria,
example.
that's not going to cause
I'm
a crazy
saying
amount of anti-U.S. resentment.
I'm
That's what you're suggesting.
I'm saying that's just an example. I'm saying it needs to be a different transition. It needs to be a gradual transition, and it can't just be you throw in a democracy and then leave.
But
That's
we're talking about this now. This the
okay.
whole issue of what we're talking about is what do we think Syria should be like? So I'm asking you. You say you gave some ideas, which is good, but what do you think it should be like?
I think
What should the U.S. do?
okay. Well, if ISIS and Assad is defeated, and I think if you do that, it gives a huge statement about the U.S. and its power, and it gives the Middle East a a more concern and more a uh, a view of the U.S. where we can't just do what we're doing and expect to get away with it. Um, and with that said, hopefully, if you because this is a task that if the U.S. is able to pull off, is going to be a very at least a good temporary victory. Would you say that if the U.S. is able to defeat ISIS and Assad?
The only thing is, I just think honestly that's pretty naive and a pipe dream, considering Russia loves Assad, and if we fight Assad, it'll be a proxy war against Russia.
I see. I don't know if that's necessarily the case because we have troops on the border of Crimea and it hasn't led to a war either. And that's an even bigger issue because that's an
But
area
it
that
could
they
lead. We
directly
have,
wanted to take over.
but we have troops right there. It could lead to a war
But
in
it
a
hasn't
finger.
because I think it shows to what extent Russia is willing to go with this. As long as see, that's something I think that Obama did was well. You put troops there and you send a message you're not going to do this. And that see, the sadly was Obama did it in one place but didn't do it in another.
But the troops in Poland aren't fighting. The troops in Syria that you're proposing are going to somehow have to fight ISIS, and they're going to have to fight Assad, and through that fight Russia.
And you
But
think,
maybe that
so you think that
maybe
this
that
has the
creates.
potential to go to World War III,
I
essentially.
think that if we play it wrong, it definitely has the potential to go to World War III.
So you're saying if we fight Assad, it's going to go to World War III because Assad and Russia are butt
No, I'm
fighting.
not. I'm saying what I said is I just said if we play our cards wrong, it has the potential to go
Well,
to
you're
World
saying
War III.
killing Assad is playing the cards wrong because Assad and Russia are friends. Essentially, you're going to play the cards wrong no matter what you do if you
No,
choose
I'm
to take
saying
Assad.
the way you're devising this tactic, which is let's fight ISIS, show Assad, and then let's fight Assad. But once Assad is in power again, then he'll be firmly entrenched. If they both weaken each other, then we can come in at a later time, which is no more naive than your idea of somehow beating both and beating Russia and beating all the other
We're
nations.
not beating Russia. That's where we differ. I don't. You make it seem like Russia is extremely involved and so passionate about
They sort
Assad
of
that
are.
if Assad is, what loss do they get if Assad is defeated? What's the loss?
They lose their ally in the Middle East.
They don't have other allies, such as the Iranian government that funds other
They have
terrorist organizations.
Iran, but Iran and Syria and Russia make up the triangle of their Middle Eastern alliance. I think you're taking a naive view on this by saying, "Yeah, we'll just go in there, we'll fight, we'll beat ISIS first of all." And by the way, once we beat ISIS, they'll be totally demoralized and crushed, and there won't be any other attacks worldwide. And then
I
we'll
never said that.
and then we'll go and fight Assad, and we'll beat him, and then there won't be a problem. And then and then out of a number of ideas, we'll insert our own benevolent dictator there, who the people will love, and then they'll transition to democracy.
Okay.
And you're saying that my idea to let them fight it out, and then when they're both weakened, either come in with a diplomatic solution where civilians have been cleared out because we've created these safe spaces, and then later on create a diplomatic solution, or then engage in fighting between the two groups who have been weakened. You're saying that my idea
No,
is
I'm
somehow
saying your
more
idea is
naive than
essentially
yours.
what's been happening for the last 5 to 7 years, and we've seen what's happened from it. But when you go sturdy and you put troops on the ground, we don't know what that looks like in this situation because we don't know to the extent how much confidence these two groups have because of our laid back approach and the way we've approached it for the last 5 to 7 years. And your version is just a continuation, and we've seen five
No,
military victories flee.
where my idea highly differs is that using force, and if this means strict force, I've said this before, but to carve out these safe areas to get the civilians out. Get the civilians out. That's where my idea differs from the policies of the past. And it's funny because you're saying this has been sucky, and which it has been, but not all change is necessarily good. Ratcheting this up as we've delineated and talked about for the last hour could lead to any number of things, most of which are probably just going to either enmesh us more, create a proxy war conflict,
That's all. That's
and
all
either
hypothesis.
or have Assad back there, Assad in power, hurting his own civilians
Well,
again.
that's already what he's doing, and that's all
But then
hypothesis.
but if you have him just in power by himself, he's going to keep purging, and we're going to be back where we started. Except we're going to be minus a million more, probably more than a million civilians dead, and minus 10 million fled at the time. So I don't
Minus
understand.
ISIS, which is another issue, though. You're acting like getting rid of ISIS isn't
It's
a is
obviously a big deal, but
okay.
It's more nuanced than just putting boots on the ground. Because again, as I said, we're concerned about ISIS fighting. We're concerned about ISIS attacks in the U.S. We need to cut them off at the tentacles and not let them even infiltrate the
Okay,
U.S.
and that's
via
all right. Let's just
via
get closing points. So finish off your thing.
we need to fight them through the internet, not even let them attack the U.S. via communicating with lone wolves in the U.S. And what we have to do, I think we have to take a pragmatic approach to this, which, as I've said before, is support Kurdistan in their fight, carve out these safe areas with force if necessary, which I think is very important, and send in again special ops for missions to both, and more special ops than we have, not just to train but also to for specific targeted missions to weaken both the Assad government and weaken ISIS, so that if they keep fighting each other, they will be even more weakened in the future. And at a point that's better than it is now, we can swoop in either for a peace deal or to fight both of them. But at a point when we're in a higher position of power, and as I've said before, we need to keep this war going on the internet.
All right, 1 second. And
Because I don't believe that just fighting ISIS will will lead to any change in the status quo because, again, although ISIS is terrible and I 100% agree with that, Assad has been leading to this refugee crisis. He's
Okay.
been the bulk of the refugee crisis that you've been bemoaning as
Yes.
the ruiner of Europe and the ruiner of the U.S.
All right. So
So
here's where I'll.
you want to naively just fight ISIS, and then suddenly that'll send a message that'll suddenly put that, and then we'll suddenly fight Assad. But Russia will be totally fine with that, even though Russia props up Assad. And then once that's done, we'll insert this dictator into the mix, and I'm sure
All right.
people
You
will
keep saying
definitely
it like that's
will.
the thing that I stand for. I
All
was
right,
giving an
well,
example. You're taking things out of
out of one
context
of your ideas, something like
because you
that, and
proposed something.
people will accept us forcing our will on this on the Middle East because somehow we've never done that before. We've never forced our will in the Middle East, and that has worked, hasn't it? Come on now.
All
Let's
right.
be pragmatic here.
So
Let's not
here's
be
where. All
too
right, Adam. Here's where
idealistic.
I'll concede to you. Um, I when I start off with saying ISIS is the main focus. I will concede that it's probably there's definitely better ways to handle it than just focus on one group. Now, you say that I completely changed my view when I say I believe that the Trump administration should give the military more leeway.
No,
And
I didn't say you should change your
okay,
view. I just said that's softening your
I'm
view.
softening my view when I say that the military Trump administration should give the military more leeway and allow them to strategize the way they believe. And I am and that is why Obama had a huge unfavorability rating with the military, even though he pulled out troops, while the military supported George W. Bush much more. Um,
Well, right, I'll let you talk. But the reason why I said that was softening your views is because you had made it sound like you were supporting large amounts of troops on the ground, and then you said, "Well, I'll let Trump do what he wants."
so I'm not saying let Trump do what he wants. I'm saying let Trump loosen his hold on the military compared to Obama, so the military can do what it wants.
Okay.
And here's and so I agree. There can be a three-pronged approach where you approach ISIS and Assad at the same time, and if I if it leads to essentially the media makes it seem like we're in a cold war anyway. So I don't know if this will make it how much worse it'll make it, but there needs to be caution. I agree there has to be caution with Russia's involvement with Assad, and there might have to be some diplomacy on that side. Okay. However, I firmly believe your version is a continuation of what has happened already in the strategy, except now you're giving a direct route for people to escape. And you say that the internet, cutting off access from the internet, is going to weaken their
Aggressively.
aggressively is going to weaken their stronghold, as if terrorist groups have never existed or grew without the internet.
No, it'll weaken. No, it'll weaken their direct threat to the U.S. to U.S. citizens.
And I disagree with that because people are still fleeing, and I don't think it's just ISIS that's the issue altogether.
Well, the
There are
vast majority of people are fleeing.
radical Islamic terrorists. There are radical Islamic terrorist attacks that solely happen because of
Dave, do you
parents
feel
and
proud for
statements.
saying that?
What?
Do you feel proud for saying that? Do you feel proud for saying radical Islamic terrorists? Because we all know that's what it is, but like you make it sound like it's some sort of like distinction for you to be saying that.
I'm emphasizing where the philosophy comes from, and it comes from Islamic
Okay,
philosophy and ideals.
but it's not as
Proving,
if
wait, but let me, okay, because I say that because you can eliminate the internet and you can do that, but the philosophy will always exist, and that's why I believe to some extent you gotta show force and put troops on the ground and show we don't tolerate this as the Western world. But why is it wrong that I say radical Islamic terrorists?
I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying do you feel proud for saying it? Because I'll say radical Islamic terrorism. I really don't care. But what is it? What does it accomplish here?
Because
Okay,
it's a
like
specific type of terrorism. It comes from a specific philosophy. It comes from a specific religion and book.
so every time you mentioned, you haven't said terrorism, which we know would be equated to the same thing in this. I don't
No,
know.
no, no. Because
Republicans have this infatuation with saying that. I know this is a little bit off topic, but it's a pet peeve of mine politically because as if that'll suddenly
hey, if there was
now we're
radical,
focused on the
hey,
real
listen,
issue.
if there was
We've still
radical
been fighting the radical
hey, if
Islamic
there was a
terrorists this whole
hey,
time.
listen, if there was a religion, another religion, radical Hindu terrorism, radical Christianity terrorism, radical Buddhist terrorism, and it was affecting U.S. soil, then I absolutely would address it that way.
Yeah, but
I
what I'm saying is we've been fighting them the whole time. I don't understand how saying it's different. The only difference is when you say
Because
that
people seem to forget where
you
this
give
philosophy comes from, in my opinion.
but when you say that you give license for the two Indians killed in Kansas because the people thought they were Iranian. You get license for the mosque burnings in Canada and the mosque burnings in Florida
Because I say radical Islamic terrorism, I get licensed for that.
because you give because you're whether or not everyone. I mean, not
What difference
everyone.
does two words make? Why does it offend you so much?
What difference do words make? Come on, you
Two
can't. You
words. Two words.
two words. You can't be seriously be saying what difference do two words make?
I'm addressing it as
There,
radical Islamic
Juden. Come
terrorism
on,
because that's what it is.
words make a huge deal,
I'm
and you know that
is it
too.
not radical Islamic terrorism?
It is,
Okay, so then what is
when
the issue?
Republicans pat themselves on the back for saying this as if they've accomplished something, all it does is for the regular populace of America who is not able to access the political arguments as some others are. They're
I'm not
giving
I'm not
license to
I'm not a
license to Islamophobia.
I'm not a politician, and I agree that ignorance comes from lack of researching and lack of information. But those people are just as capable as I am of analyzing the situation and seeing where the philosophy comes from. Okay, that's a whole different issue of the ignorance and lack of education and curiosity in this country. But when I'm saying radical Islamic terrorism, I'm not condoning the ignorance at all. I'm just seeing it for what it is, and I don't judge a Muslim because of what I see as radical Islamic terrorism. I know there's a huge difference between a religion and an ideology. So I realize that, but it derives from the same book, and that's the sad thing about this.
Well,
So don't put
the
me
only reason I'm
in book
asking
as
you is
that
because the only reason I'm asking you this is because throughout this whole episode you said radical
because
Islamic
that's what it is.
terrorism,
Yes,
but like you as if you I know that's what it is, but as if you're emphasizing these words as if they're the holy grail of some sort of
yes, I like to
ideology.
emphasize it. I like to
But
emphasize it because we had a president that refused to call it that, and
yes,
you
and
know
then
what?
now we have a president who does, and now we have mosque attacks, even though they were
And
still fighting the same exact terrorists, as if that now solves the problem.
okay, but I'm not condoning that. I'm
I'm not
against
saying that,
that.
but when you start talking about this and you start connecting, is people know that obviously Al Qaeda is
All
Muslim and
right, wait a
obviously
second.
ISIS is
Let me
Muslim,
make
but
you
when you
happy,
start,
Adam. Let me make you
oh,
happy. All the people listening here. I do not put radical Islam and Islam in the same category.
I know
I
you're
do
not
not
saying that,
condone it. So
but
let's
when
stop talking about it like I'm condoning that and I'm one of those
I'm not
ignorant
saying
people.
that at
So we're
all.
going to
I'm
cut this
saying
conversation now and finish it up. I believe your version is a continuation, except we're giving these civilians a place to hide and we're cutting off the internet, and I don't see how that solves the issue. And it's just we've seen what it does. It leads 5 million people astray. It leads to Brexit, and it leads to thousands of deaths. And maybe we should try something different. And that's where I'm going to finish off.
okay, Dave. This was a very great episode. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. It's our longest one up to date, and so I'm Adam Ginsberg signing off.
Yep. I'm
And
David. Thank you for listening.
all right.